Book 3, Chapter 48, Supernatural Weapons. Vashishta said, King Vidaratha, finding the high-shouldered king of Sindhu before him, was enraged, like the raging sun in his midday fury. The twanging of his bow resonated in the air on all sides, and growled as loudly as the howling of winds in the caverns of mountains. He drew his arrows from his dark quiver and shot them, like the rays of the sun rising from the womb of night. Each arrow, flung from the bowstring, flew like thousands in the air, and fell like millions on the ground. The king of Sindhu was equally expert in his archery, as both of these archers owed their skill with bows to the favor of Vishnu. Some of these darts were called bolts, which blocked the aerial passages, like door bolts do their doors. They fell down on the ground with a loud roar of thunderbolts. Others, decorated with gold, flew hissing as if blown by the winds. After shining like stars in the sky, fell like blazing meteors on the ground. Showers of shafts poured constantly from the hands of Vidaratha, like the ceaseless torrents of rivers or billows of the sea, or the endless radiation of solar rays. Shells and bullets were flying about like sparks of fire struck out of the balls of red-hot iron, and falling like flowers of forests blown away by gusts of wind. They fell like showers of rainwater and like the rush of waterfalls, as plentifully as the sparks of fire that flew from Vidaratha's burning city. The jarring sound of their bowstrings hushed the clamor of the two armies, like a calm quiets the roaring of the raging sea. The course of arrows was as the stream of Ganges, the milky path. In heaven, running towards the king of Sindhu, as the river runs to meet the sea. Sindhu. The shower of arrows flying from the golden bow of the king was like a flood of rain falling under the variegated rainbow in the sky. Then from the window, Dalila, who was the native of that city, saw the darts of her husband rushing like the currents of the Ganges against the Sindhu forces, resembling a sea. She understood the flight of those darts to promise victory to her Lord, and then spoke gladly to Saraswati with her lotus-like mouth. Be victorious, O goddess, and behold victory waiting on the side of my Lord, whose darts are piercing the rocks and breaking them to pieces. As she was uttering these words full of affection, The goddesses eyed her sideways and smiled at her womanish tenderness of heart. The flaming fire of Sindhu swallowed the raging sea of Vidaratha's arrows, like an undersea fire consumes water. And like Janu drank the stream of Ganges, the Sindhu missile weapons thwarted the thickening arrows of his adversary and drove them back, broken and flying as dust in the empty air. As an extinguished lamp loses its light in the air, so the flashes of the fire arms disappeared in the sky, and nobody knew where they fled. Having thus dispelled the shower of arrows, the Sindhu king sent a thick cloud of his weapons, appearing as hundreds of dead bodies flying in the air. Vidaratha repelled them quickly by means of his better bolts, as a hurricane disperses the frightening clouds in the air. Both kings, baffled in their aims by opposing arms, let indiscriminately loose against each other, laid hold on more powerful missiles. Sindhu let fly his magic missile that was a gift from a Gandharva. It kept the army of his enemy all spellbound, except Vidaratha himself. Struck with this weapon, the soldiers became as mute as moonstruck, staring in their looks and appearing as dead bodies or as pictures in a painting. As the soldiers of Vidaratha remained spellbound within their files, King Vidaratha employed his instruments of a countercharm to remove the spell. This awakened the senses of his men like morning twilight reveals a bed of lotuses, and the rising sun opens their closed petals to light. The Sindhu king fired his rage at them like the raging. He flung his serpentine weapons upon them, which bound like a band around all their bodies, encircling the battleground and air like snakes wrapped round crags and rocks. The ground was filled with snakes, like a lake with the spreading stalks of lotuses. And the bodies of gigantic warriors were bound by them, like hills by huge and horrible hydras. Everything was overpowered by the sharp power of the poison, and the inhabitants of the hills and forests were benumbed by the venomous infection. The sharp poison spread a fiery heat all around, and the frozen snows, like firebrands, sent forth their burning particles, which were blown by the hot winds in the air. The fully armed Vidaratha, equally skilled in arms, then had recourse to his Garuda, divine eagle anti-serpent weapons. They fired like mountain eagles on all sides. Their golden wings spread in the sky on all sides and embroidered the air with purple gold. The flapping of their wings wheezed like a breeze that blew the poisonous vapor far away into the air. It made the snakes breathe out of their nostrils with a hissing resembling the gurgling waters in a whirlpool in the sea. The flying Garuda weapons devoured the land-creeping serpents with a whistling noise, like that of the waters being sucked up by Agastya. The face of the ground delivered from its covering of these reptiles again appeared to view like the surface of the earth reappears to life after its deliverance from the waters of the deluge. Afterwards, the army of Garudas disappeared from sight. Like a line of lamps put out by the wind, and like an assembly of clouds vanishes in autumn. They fled like flying mountains, fearing the bolts of thundering Indra, and vanished like the impermanent world seen in a dream, or like a castle in the sky built by fancy. Then King Sindhu shot his shots of dark smoke that darkened the scene like the dark cave under the ground. It hid the face of the earth and sky like floodwaters. Reaching to the sky's face. It made the army appear like a shoal of fishes, and the stars like gems shining in the deep. The spreading darkness appeared like a sea of ink or dark mud, or like the particles of Anjana Hill, borne by the breeze over the face of nature. All beings seem to be immersed in the sea or darkness and lose their energies, as in the deep gloom of midnight. Vidaratha, the best of the most skillful in ballistics, fired his sun-bright shot, which, like the sun, illuminated the vault of the sky. It rose high amidst the spreading darkness, like the sun with its effulgent beam, and dispelled the shades of darkness as autumn does the raining cloud. The sky, being cleared of its veil of darkness, manifests itself with its reddish clouds that resemble the ruddy bodices of maidens before the king. Now the landscape appeared in full view, like the understanding of men coming in full play after the extinction of their greed. The enraged Sindhu then lay hold of his dreadful demon Rakshasa weapon, which he instantly flung on his enemy with its bedeviled darts. These horrid and destructive darts flew on all sides in the air and roared like the sea in the gigantic, dark clouds of heaven. They were like flames of bright fire. and with their long licking tongues and ash-colored and smoky curls, rising like white hairs on the head, made a tat-tat sound like that of moist mule dung. They wheeled around in circles in the air with a horrible tang-tang noise, now flaming as fire and now fuming as smoke, and then flying about as sparks of fire. Their mouths beset by rows of sprouting teeth, like lotus stalks, and faces defaced by dirty and moldy eyes. Their hairy bodies were like stagnant pools, full of moss and weeds. They flew about and flashed and roared aloud like dark clouds, while the locks of hairs on their heads glared like lightning in the midway sky. At this instant, Vidaratha, Lila's husband, sent forth his Narayana weapon that had the power to suppress wicked spirits and demons. The appearance of this magic weapon made the bodies of the Rakshasa demons disappear like darkness at sunrise. This entire army of fiends was lost in the air, like the dark clouds of the rainy season vanish into nothing at the approaching of autumn. Then Sindhu discharged his firearms, which set fire to the sky and began to burn down everything like the all-destroying conflagration of the last day. They filled all the sides of air with clouds of smoke that seemed to hide the face of heaven under the darkness of hell. They set fire to the woods and the hills, which burned like mountains of gold, while the trees appeared to bloom with yellow plumera flowers all around. All the sides of the sky above and the hills, woods, and groves below were enveloped in the flames, as if they were covered under the red powder of holy with which Yama, the god of the underworld, was playing over the flame. The heaven-spreading flames burnt legions into a heap of ashes, like the undersea fire consumes entire ships and fleets in the sea. As Sindhu continued to dart his firearms against the defeated adversary, Vidaratha let off his watery arms with reverential regard. Filled with water, they flew forward like the shades of darkness from their hidden self. They spread up and down on all sides like a melted mountain gushing in 100 cataracts. They stretched like mountainous clouds or like a sea in the air, and fell in showers of watery arrows and stones on the ground. They flew up like large tamara trees and fell in showers and gathered in groups, like the shades of night, appeared as the thick gloom beyond the polar mountain. They gave the sky the appearance of subterranean caves, emitting a gurgling sound like the loud roaring of elephants. These waters soon drank the spreading furious fire, like the shades of the dark night. Swallow the surrounding red tints of the evening. Having swallowed the fires above, the waters flooded the ground and filled it with a humidity which served to weaken all bodies, as the power of sleep numbs everybody in death-like torpidity. In this manner, both the kings were throwing their enchanted weapons against each other, and found them equally quelling and repelling one another. The heavy-armed soldiers of Sindhu and the captains of the regiments were swept away by the flood together with the war cars that floated upon it. At this moment, Sindhu thought upon his thermal weapons, which possessed the miraculous power of preserving his people from the water. He hurled them in the air. These absorbed the waters like the sun sucks up the moisture of the night, and dried up the land and revived the soldiers, except those that were already dead and gone. Their heat chased the coldness like the rage of the illiterate against the learned, and made the moist ground as dry as when sultry winds strew the forest land with dried leaves. It decorated the face of the ground with a golden color, like when the royal dames adorn themselves with yellow paint. It put the soldiers on the opposite side in a state of feverish fainting, like when the tender leaves of trees are scorched by the warmth of a wildfire in summer heat. Siddhartha, in his warlike rage, took up his bow, bent it to a curve, and let fly his cloudy arms on his enemy. They sent forth columns of clouds as thick as the dark shades of night, which, flying upward like a forest of dark tamara trees, spread a shelter heavy with water on high. They lowered under the weight of the water, stood still by their massive thickness, and roared aloud in their circles over the sky. They blew the winds, dropping the dewdrops from the icy shore they bore on their wings. Showers of rain fell quickly from the clouds collected on high. Then fiery lightning flashed from the clouds like golden serpents, or rather like side glances from the eyes of heavenly Apsara nymphs. The roaring of the clouds rebounded in the mountainous caverns of the sky, and the quarters of heaven echoed with the sound like the hoarse noise of the roaring of lions, and with flashes and the growling of tigers and bears. Showers of rain fell in the floods, with drops as big as mallets, and with flashes of lightning that threatened like stern glances from the god of death. Huge mists rose up in the form of vapor of the earth and were carried aloft into the sky by the heated air. They seemed like demons rising from the infernal regions. The miracle of the warfare ceased after a while. Like worldly desires subside to rest upon tasting the sweet joys attaining on divine knowledge. The ground became full of mud and mire and was impassable everywhere. Horses of Sindhu were flooded by the watery deluge, like the Sindhu River Indus of the sea. Then he hurled his airy weapons that filled the vault of heaven with winds and raged in all their fiery light Bhairava spirits on the last day of resurrection. The winds blew on all sides of the sky, with darts falling like thunderbolts and hailstones, now piercing and then crushing all bodies, as if by the last blast of nature on the doomsday. Chapter 49. More supernatural weapon. The Shista. Then blew the icy winds of winter, blasting the beauty of the forest tree foliage, shaking and breaking the beautiful tree, and covering them with gusts of dust. Then arose a gale, whirling the trees like birds flying in the air, dashing and smashing soldiers on the ground, and hurling and breaking buildings to dust. This dreadful squall blew away Vidaratha and his force, like a rapid current carries away broken and rotten fragments of wood. Then Vidaratha, skilled in ballistics, hurled his huge and heavy arrows that stretched themselves to the sky and withstood the force of wind and rain. Opposed by these rock-like barriers, the airy weapons were at a standstill. Just like animal spirits are checked by the firm detachment of the soul, trees that had been blown up by the winds and were floating in the breezy air now came down and fell upon dead bodies, like flocks of crows upon putrid cartridges. The shouting from the city, the distant hum of the village, the howling of forests, and the rustling of the trees ceased on all sides, like the vain words of men. Sindhu saw burning rocks falling from above like leaves of trees and flying about like the winged Mekankas, mind born from Apsara, or moving rocks of the sea or Sindhu. Then he hurled his thundering weapons, falling like flaming thunderbolts from heaven, which burnt the rocks away like flaming fire destroys darkness. These falling bolts broke the stones with their pointed ends and hewed down hilltops like a hurricane scattering fruit from trees on the ground. Vidaratha then darted his Brahma weapon to quell the thunderbolt, which jostled against one another, disappeared in their mutual conflict. Sindhu then cast his demonic weapons as black as darkness, which fled as lines of horrid Vishaka demons on all sides. They filled the sky with the darkness of their bodies and made the daylight turn to the shade of night, as if it were for fear of them. They were as strong in their figures as huge columns of smoke, and as dark in their complexion as the blackish pitch, and tangible to the hand. They were like lean skeletons, with erect hair on their head and bearded faces, with looks as pale as those of beggars, and body as black as those of the aerial and nocturnal fiends. They were terrific and like idiots in their looks, and moved about with bones and skulls in their hands. They were meager as churls, but more cruel than either the sword or thunderbolt. The Vishaka demon goat lurk about woods, bogs, and highways, and pry into empty and open door houses. They hunt about like ghosts in their dark forms, and fly away as fast as fleeting lightning. With fury they ran and attacked the remaining enemy forces that stood weaponless in the field with their broken and sorrowful hearts. Frightened to death, they stood motionless and dropped down their arms and armor and stood petrified, as if they were demon-struck, with staring eyes, open mouths, and unmoving hands and feet. They let fall both their lower and upper garments, loosened their bowels, and slackened their bodies through fear, and kept shaking like trees by the wind. The line of the Pishakas then advanced to frighten Vidaratha out of his wits. But he had the good sense to understand them as the mere magic mumbo-jumbo. He knew the counter-charm to force the Pishakas from the field, and employed his charmed weapons against the enemy Vishaka army. He fired his Rupika weapon with anger, which gave comfort to his own army and deluded the enemy Pishaka force. These Rupikas flew in the air with erect hairs on their heads, their terrific eyes sunk in their sockets. Their waists and breasts moved like trees with bunches of fruit. They had passed their youth and become old. Their bodies were bulky and worn out with age. They had deformed backs and hips and protuberant navels and knees. They had dark, dusky bodies and held human skulls in their hands, all besmirched with blood. They had bits of half-devoured flesh in their mouths and pouring out flesh from their sides. They had a variety of gestures, motions, and contortions of their bodies, which were as hard as stone, with wry faces, crooked hats, and twisted legs and limbs. Some had their faces like dogs, crows, and owls, with broad mouths and flat cheekbones and belly. And held human skulls and entrails in their hands. They laid hold of the Pishakas like men catch children, and joined them in one body as their consort. They joined together in dancing and singing with outstretched arms and mouths and eyes, now joining hand in hand, and now pursuing one another in their merry sport. They stretched their long tongues from their horrid mouths and licked away the blood exuding from the wounds of the dead bodies. They plunged in the pool of blood with as much delight as they had dived into a pond of ghee. They scrabbled in the muddy puddle with their outstretched arms and feet and uplifted ears and nose. They rolled and jostled with one another in the puddle of carrion and blood and made it swell like the milky ocean when churned by Mandara Mountain. As Vidaratha employed his magic weapon against the magic of Sindhu, so he had recourse to others from a sense of his inferiority. He fired his Vetala weapon, which made dead bodies, whether with or without their heads, rise up in a body in their ghastly shape. The joint forces of the Vetalas, Vishakhas, and Rupikas represented a dreadful appearance, like that of the Kavandas, and they seemed as if ready to destroy the earth. The other monarch was not slow to show his magic skill by hurling his demon Rakshasa weapon, which threatened the grass and devour the three worlds. Their gigantic bodies rose as high as mountains. With their ghostly forms, they seemed like hellish fiends appearing from the infernal regions. The ferocious body of the roaring Rakshasas terrified both gods and demons with their loud martial music and war dance of their headless trunks. The giddy Vetalas, Yakshas, and Kushmandas devoured the fat and flesh of dead bodies as their toast, and drank the gory blood as their lurid wine in the course of their war dance. The hopping and jumping of the Kushmandas in their war dance in streams of blood scattered its crimson particles in the air, which, assembled in the form of a bridge of red evening clouds over the sparkling sea. So we've been treated to a long litany of horrible visions and scenes. Of terrible weapon, Rakshasa demons. And for what purpose? To balance faulty knowledge constructs in the Manomaya person. All right, so we'll continue with chapter 50, the dead of Viduratha, tomorrow.